Welcome to Book Banter with me, your host, Dianne Burkhart. I hope you will join me every Wednesday as we explore all things to do with, well, books. Let's get on with our show today. Hello, my happy people. I hope you're all having a wonderful day wherever you are. I am recording this message on June 25th, and hopefully you are listening to it on July 9th. You might be wondering why I am doing this so far ahead whenever I usually do it on the day. We are actually out of the country. We got a house sitter. We shipped Shaggy off to his babysitter's house where they happen to have a girl dog, so you know he's having a nice vacation too. And I set all of this stuff up to broadcast on its own, so fingers crossed that you're actually listening to this on July 9th. That means I did something right. Now today we're going to be speaking with a romantic women's fiction author, and I have to tell you, honestly, I hate interviews like this. Now wait before you start to worry. It's a good reason. Linda and I had such a wonderful conversation. She has led such an interesting life, and we just talked for so long, and I had to decide what to cut out. And every bit that I cut out just gave me chest pains because it was all such fantastic and interesting information. And I wanted to bring all of it to you, but because of the time constraints for my subscription for my podcast host site, I had to cut it down. And the only thing I can think of is maybe at some point I might see about putting these raw interviews without all of these edits that I do, the heavy editing for time, up on something like Patreon, where you can go there and subscribe and listen to all of the long form, full audios of all of the interviews, because there's so many that I have had like this. And I really do wish I could bring you all of this information, because trust me, all of it is gold. But let's stop with all the blather right now. I'm sure you're just wanting to get right to the interview and hear everything about this wonderful author from the woman herself. So please welcome to Book Banter with Dianne Burkhart, Linda Hughes. Since you've already listened to a show or two, you know that the way that I like to start these episodes is just to have our guests tell everyone who you are and what you do.
Hi, I'm Linda Hughes, and I am an author of romantic women's fiction. I've been doing that for a while now. I have 29 novels and novellas in print, and I just absolutely love telling stories about women's journeys. And so I love to get my characters into trouble, and then I love getting them out of trouble. And before I did this, I had a 20-year career as a seminar leader, and I was very fortunate to work with a company that sent me all over the United States, but also sent me all over the world. And I've always said I learned so much more from people around the world than they possibly could have learned from me. And one of the things I love to do in my writing is incorporate the stories that I heard, the people that I met, the places that I was so fortunate to be able to go to. And so all of that somehow ends up in my writing in different ways. And romantic women's fiction is kind of confusing to people sometimes because it's not the same as romance. Women's fiction, as you probably know, if you're a reader of this genre, is always the story of a woman's journey in life. And there can be romance on the side, but the main point of the story is her making it through her struggles and making sure that she prevails in the end. And I always put some romance in there as well. So you can expect some happy endings, but they're not usually what you expect. Writing those women's stories means a great deal to me. I also incorporate a lot of history and sometimes some mystery. A ghost shows up every now and then. So there's a little bit of everything in the stories that I tell. And that's me.
I think you would have a lot of personal experience, not just from being exposed to all these different cultures, but on writing a story about somebody who has to rebuild their life.
Oh, absolutely. And over the years, I've heard so many stories from people who've had to do just that, Diane. In fact, one of the ones I wanted to make sure to tell you about is a novella that I wrote. It's part of my Shades of Hope novella collection. And one of the stories a woman told me was her grandmother. She was German. She had lived through World War II in Nazi Germany. And so after the war, she took her young children and she was able to make her way to the United States. So here's her granddaughter, an American, who has this sweet little religious grandmother who, now that the granddaughter has grown up, and this is in real life, the grandmother starts telling her the real story of what happened in Germany during World War II for her. As a widow with young children to feed, she had no choice but to become a prostitute. That was how she fed her family. And of course, her granddaughter was so shocked and could not believe that her sweet little grandmother had to endure that. And it made her respect her grandma in a way she never had before. She'd always just seen her as a nice little old lady.
Hmm.
And so it's really a lesson in what people go through that we often don't know. Of course, when we're children, they don't tell us their stories. It's not appropriate for children. But once we grow up, I think it's very important to ask our elders what their lives were really like when they were younger, when they were children, and when they were young adults, because those are things we don't see as their descendants. And
Hmm.
so it's that kind of story. That one was very serious. Not all my stories are quite that serious, although that one did have a very happy ending. That's the kind of thing that I think is important to incorporate in my stories because I want everyone to know we all go through some hard times, hopefully not that hard, but
Hmm.
we all go through some hard times. And there are people who made their way through, they prevailed, and we can too, because that's part of life.
Do you incorporate any of your own life story into your books?
Oh, yes, I certainly do. I was raised in a small town, very small town. I have 50 first cousins, 50. A lot of people are shocked at that.
Yeah. I thought I had a lot,
And
but I don't come near that.
yeah, I know. One set of grandparents lived next door, another set was a couple blocks away on a little farm, and cousins all over the place. And so I love incorporating small towns in my stories. I don't always, but I love doing that because I certainly know what that was like. And then, of course, with my age, I was a child of the 60s. I was a teenager and went to college in the 60s and the 70s. And it was a time of upheaval, as you know from history, in our country because of the Vietnam War.
Mhm.
And I was a war protester. I would do things like take the bus from Michigan, where I went to college, and I'd take the bus to Washington, D.C. to march and protest, and came home and married a Vietnam veteran. Unfortunately, he was a victim of Agent Orange, which you've
Oh.
probably heard about. It was a
Hmm.
toxin used in Vietnam. And
Hmm.
so they came home and were ill, and many died. And my husband died 7 years after he came home. So I was 28 years old. I was a widow, and I truly felt like my life was over. It was just, where do you go from there? I'd been in love. We had all these plans for our life together, and we were going to travel and we were going to have children someday. And that was all just completely gone. So I know what it's like for someone when they have these pictures in their head of what they think their life is going to be like. And then all of a sudden, those pictures disappear.
Hmm.
There's that point of limbo where we don't know which way to turn, don't know which way to go. It can't even make decisions for a while because there's no point of reference. And so I wrote a book, one of my very first published book, by the way, just last year had its 25th anniversary.
Oh, wow.
And it's called Homecoming Queen because I was homecoming queen at my little college. and it was real controversial. There were protests against me. You haven't lived, I'll tell you, until you have protests against you. And because I'd been a war protester and there were people who didn't like that, and I wasn't traditional, I wasn't in a sorority, but I won anyway. And so part of it's really fun and funny, but it's the love story of this young couple. I wrote it as fiction, and it is the love story of this young couple, and he dies, and then she has to rebuild her life, which I did eventually. Made some mistakes along the way. There were some ups and downs, but I eventually was able to carry on and live in a way that to me was an honor to his memory.
Hmm.
He certainly did love life and loved traveling and loved doing all kinds of things, which I continue to do. And then 11 years later, I did remarry my husband today. We've been married 37 years.
Oh,
But
wow.
that story, yeah, that story, that struggle was just so important to me to share. And the book sold really well 25 years ago when it first came out. And Miramax called me. They were going to make a movie of it, and then Miramax was sold, and that didn't happen. But it was a bestseller, and there was some real interest in the book. 25 years later, it's interesting, Dianne, how our writing changes over time. Because when I knew the anniversary was coming up and I knew I wanted to do some work with it, I read it again and I couldn't believe how many words I used. As a writer, my writing has changed, and I think readership has changed as well. I think we like things to be faster. We want things to happen more quickly. I think we want more action, not so much in the head.
Hmm.
At least my readers do for today, for romantic women's fiction. And so I took out 25,000 words.
Wow.
Yeah, I know that's a lot, and readers may not be able to picture what that means, but it means it went from being a 400-page book to a 300-page book. I've really enjoyed doing that, and I've since written a sequel about that as well. So, yes, that was a very long answer to your question was, do I use my own life experience? And I do.
Do you think it's cathartic to do that?
It is. And I think in the beginning, when I was first writing 25 years ago, it was cathartic. That was what the writing was all about for me.
Hmm.
And over the years, as I feel like I've become a more professional writer, it's still cathartic. I still love it. But now, sometimes it's just more humorous to me, humorous in terms of, oh my gosh, this is so much fun. This is interesting. I can't wait to get the story out there. For example, the one I just wrote is a school teacher, 25 years. She's burned out. She's had it with the kids. She's never been married. I always thought she'd be married. She's totally upset with her life. It's her 50th birthday. And I was just having so much fun putting this woman into trouble. And then having to figure out. So for me, it was almost like a puzzle that I had to figure out, okay, how are we going to get this poor girl out of trouble?
Hmm.
And she rents a cottage on an island. It's part of a trilogy I'm writing. She rents a cottage on an island to be all by herself. She hates everyone. She hates children. She's had it with the whole world. And of course, she's sitting on the beach reading a book and she meets a 7-year-old little boy and falls in love with him, of course.
Of
And
course.
she has a dad that happens to be her age. So it is cathartic to answer your question, but it also is just an awful lot of fun.
Hmm.
And then the truth also is because I write 4 books a year, and when I'm up against a deadline, it's also a lot of work sometimes. And I'm sure you experience that. Anybody who writes on a schedule does, that there are times when you just have to knuckle down, get it done. And I'd rather be watching Netflix
Yeah,
at night, but the deadline is tomorrow. And so it's work as well, but I absolutely love it. I always wanted to be a writer. When I was 12, I wrote in my diary I was going to be a ritter. I spelled it wrong. I did not spell. I was going to be a ritter when I grew up. And then that other career came along, which I absolutely loved. I couldn't give up traveling for a long time and did some other things. And I'm like a lot of writers. I couldn't figure out how to make a living writing
Yeah.
for a long time. And I was extremely fortunate in the beginning in that with Homecoming Queen, I found an agent right away, found a New York publisher right away. The book was a bestseller. Its first day out, it sold 6,000 copies, which to me now is just phenomenal for back then. For some writers, it's not, but for me, that was the big, big deal. And then met with Miramax, as I said. And so I thought, wow, this book writing thing is really easy. Just write a book and it sells well and the movies call and oh boy did I have a long fall when reality set in. It's a lot more work than that.
Do you think that might have been even a little bit detrimental to you that everything was so successful your first time out? Or do you think that you might have gained a little bit more, I don't know, hardened more steel if it had been a little bit tougher in the beginning?
I think both. I think I was totally in the clouds in terms of my fantasy about what book writing was going to be all about. And after about a year, when my agent was wonderful, a man named Bob Fenton, and he was an elder man, and unfortunately he died. And then the publishing company I was with in New York, it was owned by a married couple, and they divorced and split up the company. And I never heard from the husband, never heard from him again. So it all just fell apart. So it took me about a year to realize I had to get a job, and make a living. But I kept writing, of course. And back then, while I was working, I was writing one book a year. And many writers can identify with this. You're busy when you have a full-time job. It took me a while to realize it's not as easy as I thought. I'm going to have to work harder than I ever imagined. And that has turned out to be true. But it did give me some grit to hang in there.
Now, I know for the longest time you were traveling around doing public presentations.
Yes.
What exactly were you doing with that?
Sometimes it just gives me chills when I realize how lucky I was. I mean, truly, truly lucky. And this is another example of we just have to hang in there, but I had to work.
Hmm.
And so I had moved to Dallas from Michigan, Dallas, Texas. And I was so naive. I knew I wanted to do training programs because I had been widowed and gone through so much stress. I felt like I had a really good stress management program.
Hmm.
And I would drive around and go to big buildings. I knew nothing about business, nothing about how businesses worked or how they hired trainers. And I would go to big buildings and go in and say, hey, I've got this great program. Let me train your employees. Because I had heard that people did that kind of thing.
Hmm.
I had a little brochure that I printed up myself. I didn't know they had videos. I had no idea. And so I went to Southwest Airlines a few times, and eventually the vice president of the company met with me, and I told her about my program. And she had me meet with another vice president and the president of the company. I mean, this is so lucky because later she and I became friends, the original vice president. And she told me the only reason she did that was because she felt sorry for me. And at first I was taken aback and a little bit hurt, a little bit insulted, but then I thought, no, go with it. I got my foot in the door. I need to go with it. And they actually taught me how to do training programs. I thought I knew, but I didn't really know how to stand up in front of a room full of 400 employees all day long and do a program with them that gave them information they could take back to work with them.
Hmm.
And so, I mean, talk about luck because I had some of the best in the industry teaching me. And then because I had been a contract trainer with them, everybody started hiring me. I was working with other airlines, companies that made airplanes. Then I started doing government work. And All of a sudden, I was doing anti-terrorism programs. I was the stress management arm of the program, and I was working for the U.S. Department of Defense, the U.S. Department of State. I worked with every branch of the military. And so the company that I worked for would send me all over the world to do public seminars, but whatever country I was in, I had usually worked with some people at the embassy there doing government work. I've been in embassies all over the world, and I was working hard. And you know what it's like when you've just got your nose down and you're just working hard. But I look back on that and how incredibly fortunate I was with the people I met and the places I went. And but when I was 50 years old, I looked around and said, okay, maybe it's time to settle down and settle
Hmm.
in and do some other things. So then I became a college professor for a while and also wrote, which was not very exciting, but I wrote textbooks. And I've discovered as a writer, if you want to make some money, write some textbooks. You may die of boredom in the process, but you will make some money. So I did that for a while as well.
Now, what did you actually teach?
My background, all my degrees are in psychology, the psychology areas, sociology, psychology, counseling, adult learning. And so I thought I would teach psychology, but the college that I applied at needed someone to teach teacher education. They needed someone to teach future teachers. So I ended up doing that and taught some of the classes that probably may not exist today. One was the DEI class,
Hmm.
which was fascinating, did a lot of research to put that together, loved, loved, loved teaching that class. So it was interesting.
Now, there was something really interesting that I read on your website, and I'm curious about this. What was it that led to you being up on a pyramid in the moonlight where you got inspiration?
Oh my goodness. So I don't think people can do this today because I think it's blocked off. But this
Hmm.
was a long time ago. It was after my husband had died. He and I had planned a trip, and this is another aside, but I had become very serious about belly dancing. Now,
Hmm.
mind you, I also had a job, but on weekends, I danced with a troupe that we danced in restaurants and at state fairs and events and made money. Okay,
Hmm.
so really into belly dancing. And my husband and I had a trip planned to the Middle East, and I was going to visit belly dancers and meet with them and had this all mapped out, all planned. And he died before that happened. And so I found another belly dancer friend and I went on the trip anyway. I truly felt like he was with me because he had been so excited about this trip as well.
Hmm.
I went to Greece, went to Turkey, went to Egypt. And so one night I'm in my room and across the desert, I can see the Great Pyramids. It was the Oberoi Hotel, beautiful hotel. And I couldn't believe, I mean, it was magical and it was surreal that I was standing on the balcony of my room looking at the Great Pyramids. And it was a beautiful night, starlit sky. And I became obsessed with the idea that I had to get out there in the night and climb the Great Pyramid because what I'd seen earlier in the day when we took a camel ride around the pyramids are like stair steps. And you've probably seen that in pictures. I had been told that in the night, people would go out there and climb up and just sit and enjoy the night.
Hmm.
So I was determined to do this. And it was magical. It was spiritual. I felt like my husband was with me. And so I took a little taxi close to the pyramids. And then I walked across the desert in the middle of the night all by myself. And I started climbing up. And I'm feeling so emotional about this. And all of a sudden, I realized that there were spots of other people there who were smoking and making out. So it wasn't quite as spiritual as I had anticipated. But that was where teenagers went. was cool. So I found my own cubby. I climbed as high as I dared go and just sat there looking at the beautiful night. And it was astounding. At that moment, I realized that I have everything that I need and I could make my life anything I wanted it to be. And that was when I made the decision to move to Dallas and to go after doing training programs. And so it gave me the courage to do that, to have that kind of perspective about my life.
That's just absolutely amazing. That's one of those kinds of stories that just gives you a chill,
Ah,
especially when you know how successful you actually were at that job that you decided to take the leap and go do. Because besides some of the places that you mentioned, you also gave lessons to Knights of England and
yes,
Lucasfilms. I mean,
yes.
it's not like you were just giving a lecture to a room full of random people who came in. You were doing this for big corporations and government entities that was just absolutely amazing. And the fact that you admitted that you just dove into it without knowing what you're going to do and figured it out, that's incredible and inspiring.
Well, I appreciate that. And what I learned was that you figure it out when you have to eat. And the truth is, I didn't have children, so I've always been aware of the fact that if had I had children, I would not have been able to make that decision.
Yeah.
And I had always wanted children. I would have loved to have children with my first husband. And so it was just fate. It was the way things worked out. And even though I had been so heartbroken over what had happened, I at some point realized I needed to just go with the way things were rather than the way I wished things would have been.
Yeah.
And I really didn't have a choice. And so I decided to make the best of that rather than wallowing in my self pity, which I did a little bit of that too in the beginning, but that was never going to get me anywhere. So I didn't. And you mentioned the Knights of England. I have to tell you a little bit about that
Hmm.
because it was beautiful. They treated me like a queen. But in my head, the Knights of England were more like in our stories, although I was aware, of course, some of them would be older. And it's probably 150 gentlemen, and they were all older. And I realized, of course, that a knight who was younger wouldn't be retired and didn't have time to go do this, probably. But they had hired me because they wanted to know about women in leadership roles and women in business. They wanted to know how they could support, as retired men, how they could support women in our world. It wasn't quite the swashbuckling I had envisioned, but I fell in love with every single one of them. Just fell in love. They were so wonderful to me. It was so lovely. And Lucasfilms, oh my word, I tried to act like a normal human being, but I was so excited just to be at the Skywalker Ranch. And I had written my first book by then, and I wanted so desperately to go into George's office and say, "Hey, George, I got this book that needs to be a movie." But I was there for another purpose. They were paying me for something else, so I couldn't.
Accidentally leave a copy of the manuscript in the break room.
I think I did leave a copy of the book somewhere. I don't remember where, but I claimed that I met George Lucas because the person who was taking me around did take me to the door of his office. The door was open. He was sitting at his desk, and the person said, "Hey, George, this is Linda. She's doing our training program." And he looked up and waved and then looked back down. So I can say I met him, right?
I
That's
count it. That counts.
yeah, that's legit. I'm sure you would never remember that. But they gave me a house of my own to
Wow.
stay for the 3 days I was there. They told me it was the house that Ron Howard stayed in whenever he came there, and Harrison Ford stayed there. And so I was running around, oh my word, Harrison Ford touched this table and Ron Howard sat in this chair. And then I'd go out and try to be a normal person and do my work. But that was great.
See, we are huge Star Wars fans in this house, so I would be doing the exact same thing. I'd be sitting in a chair just going, Harrison Ford probably sat here. you have such an incredible collection of published works. From your website, I downloaded a list of the books that you have published, the novels and novellas, and it
Okay.
lists the Highland Legacy Romance series, Shades of
Hmm.
Hope collection, which is a collection of novellas.
Hmm.
You have the O'Sullivan Family Saga novels and Ancestor Ghost series novels. Are those part of the Shades of Hope collection?
No, those are separate.
Okay.
For the ghost ones, I used my own ancestry, even some of my ancestors' names, but they're gone now. They're long dead, so they don't care. And I had an Irish ancestor who came over here and he was a lumberjack, which many Irishmen did at one time. Mackinac Island is a little island in Lake Huron in Michigan that is a very popular visitor center, tourist center in the summertime. So I researched a lot about the history of the island and what it was like when he would have been there and how all of that worked. And the history was fascinating. And so I have set a number of books since then on that island. And then The Shades of Hope, that was so much fun because I took stories that other people have told me, as well as some of my own ancestor stories. And each of the five books takes place in a different time and a different place. And so they have only one thing in common because the characters would not have known each other. But what they have in common is things go wrong in their lives and they find their way out. So I call it Shades of Hope. Each book has a different color in the name, like Black Forest and Gold Mountain and Green Valley, which I thought was so clever when I made that up.
And I want to really quickly go over some of the other ones too, because you also have the Timeless Traditions trilogy, which is also set in Mackinac Island. And
Mhm.
you have The Promise of Christmas Past, The Promise of Christmas Present, and The Promise of Christmas Forevermore. I love those titles in there. And then you also have mysteries in there too, with your burlesque amateur sleuths.
I wondered if you'd bring that one up. That might seem a little different, but actually it's still women's fiction. It's a group of women who are trying to figure things out. They get into trouble, but there is some mystery in this one. They're amateur sleuths, but they're really bad at it. And this is a trilogy. To me, this was the most fun to write because it's about a group of retired burlesque dancers. So they were in their heyday in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. And we all know what burlesque is. We're dancers who took their clothes off and they were usually quite elegant and they actually danced and there was live music, all kinds of jazz and really great music. And I had a very good friend who was a star international burlesque dancer during that era. And she told me story after story after story about what life was like back then. And I would laugh and I would cry because some of it was sad, but how they would band together and take care of each other. So my story was they're retired, their manager has stolen their retirement funds, and so they converge in Las Vegas to try to find the guy. And so there are mobsters from the old days, and there's second chance romance. They fall in love, and there are drag queens, and there's just a little bit of everything, which was true to life for how she lived her life. Her stage name was Lottie the Body, and she was probably one of the most fun human beings I've ever met in my life. But the story she told, the famous people she met, famous people she dated when she was younger and single. And so those, if I had to pick a trilogy that I would say is the most just plain fun, that would be the one that you would want to read.
Well, and I would think if people want to get a little bit of a insight into who you're talking about, they can always check out your blog because I found the story behind the twirling tassels, 7 life lessons from Lottie the Body that you published on your website January 8th, 2022.
Yeah, Lottie was an incredibly positive person. There was no calling Lottie up and complaining about life for too long. She might let you go 3 minutes and then you were done. And once I learned all of the things that she went through, she was an African American dancer. She was professionally trained when she was a child in ballet, but because she was a Black woman, there was no professional place for her to dance in the
Mhm.
dance world. So burlesque was her only option, and she loved it. But she went through some great times, but also some really hard times. And she always said that she sort of had her own civil rights movement in what she did because her audiences were very mixed and she was with all kinds of people who adored her. Men had a tendency to fall in love with her. She was just drop dead gorgeous when she was a young woman, well, and when she was an older woman as well. And so she went through a lot of hardships. So I could never call her up and complain. I always felt like, how dare I complain? I never had to go through the things that she went through as a professional. Because there were times when she was shunned. There were times when she had to use the back door. There were times when she would go with a troupe of actors and singers and comedians and dancers, and the white members of the troupe got to stay in a nice hotel, and she would end up in a dump, and they would be able to go in the front door of the club, and she would have to go in the back door of the club. All of the things that we traditionally heard about that did happen. And there were other times when she was treated like a queen by everybody, regardless of race. And so she learned to not make assumptions about people. She learned to get to know a person, and boy, did she let you know that that's what you needed to do. And so talking to her was always just a pleasure. She called me her baby boo. Baby boo,
I love that.
what are you up to today? And I did meet her, I will confess, when I was homecoming queen all those years about. I'm going full circle now to the very beginning. I needed a job. I was financially independent as a college student. I was broke. The only job I could find one summer was as a waitress in a house of burlesque. And that's where I met Lottie the Body.
That's amazing.
And Lottie just became like a second mother to me. She protected me and would explain things to me when I didn't understand.
Now, you also have several standalone novels, including your first book, The Homecoming Queen, and a few nonfiction works as well.
Yes, Homecoming Queen, I did eventually write a sequel. Let me see, I do have a few standalones left. I have Fountain Street Heat. Um, I think most of them I've written something to go with them. My nonfiction books uh, run the gamut because I was a college professor for a while. Probably our readers who read our fiction, science fiction, or women's fiction, or romance would not be interested in my textbooks.
Mhm.
That's not much of a stretch, but I do have one book with a coloring book to go with it called Memoir Magic. Because as I've mentioned, I believe that our life stories are so important. Even if someone thinks their life story is not important, it is, it absolutely is. And telling that story is cathartic. It changes how we look at other people, but it changes how we look at ourselves as
Mhm.
well. And so, Memoir Magic is a book I wrote some time ago with a writing partner. And we used to do workshops about writing your memoir. And there's a coloring book that goes with it, which is always fun. It's an outline of how to write your memoir, but you can color as you go along and look at that. So that was always a fun workshop to do. But the book, I've had some really great feedback. It's easy to read and it's helpful to people because we have so many stories to tell about where to begin. And so it just helps people organize all of that. And I did help one of my very best friends in the world. I helped her write her memoir, and it did become a bestseller. And so that was very exciting. But we had a little bit of help. She had been married at one time to a famous rock star. So that was part of the reason I think people paid attention. But she wrote a great story. And that one is called The Spark that survived.
And that was with Mira Lewis Williams.
Myra Lewis Williams, she was married to Jerry Lee Lewis, her cousin, when she was 13 years old.
Oh, that's her. Yes, I remember that story.
Yeah, that's her. And she wrote the book Great Balls of Fire many years earlier, which
Hmm.
became a movie with Dennis Quaid and Winona Ryder.
Hmm.
And then 30 years later, she said, I need to write the real story.
Hmm.
Then she was kind of afraid to tell the real story. Publishers wouldn't let her tell the real story. And she wanted her own story in her own voice. Interestingly, we got pushback from some Jerry Lee Lewis fans. And I really bristled at that because it was her story,
Yeah.
a woman's story. And because a woman was married to a famous man doesn't mean that she's lost the right to tell her own story.
Yeah.
And so we had a lot of bantering about that online at one time. I know as writers, we're not supposed to argue with readers, but I couldn't leave that one alone. And she just did a great job. It's a lovely story. She always says it's a book about how to overcome life's worst tragedies and your own dumbass decisions.
I like that. That sounds like something I could definitely identify with.
Yeah.
Well, now I think is the perfect time for us to do our five quick questions that never turn out to be quick, but one day it will happen. And until then, I'm just going to keep doing it.
Okay.
So, are you ready?
Okay.
Question one. In your bio, you state that when you were a little girl, you could not spell. Has that improved over the years?
Yeah, I wanted to be a Ritter. Um, it has improved, but I had to work at it. Because I was an avid reader as a child, I think that helped. You see the correct spelling over and over and over, and it kind of sinks in eventually. But I do work at it. But yes, I do need help still from time to time.
I always love it whenever I find authors who admit that they have trouble with spelling because I am the worst speller. And it's like I have been a professional writer since got in my 20s. And if it was not for spell check and having a dictionary beside me to check words and looking things up online, just, throwing out what I think might be the spelling and finding the right word, I don't think I would be able to have a career as a writer because it is just ridiculous how bad of a speller I am.
Well, and then sometimes I can't even get close enough for spell check to be able to pick it up and figure out what it is. And so, come on, help me out here. And your name is very interesting because I found in terms of spelling, every time I went to write your name, I had to stop and think about how is this spelled
Oh,
because
yeah.
there are two N's in Diane. It's unusual, two N's in Diane. And then Burkhart has the CK and
Hmm.
the before the T.
DT.
Yeah, German spelling.
Yeah.
And so it's beautiful, it's lovely, but I do have to stop and think about things like that.
Well, and it's incredible that I've been married for like 11 years and I still have to sound my last name out in my head as I'm spelling it to make sure I get all the letters in there. So now question two, do you have any guilty pleasures?
Oh, yeah, they probably used to be a lot more exciting than they are now when I was younger. But my guilty pleasures now, I'm sitting here. I mean, I know this isn't totally terrible, but it's not good either. I'm sitting here with drinking a Coke.
Mhm.
No, it's bad for me. I know that. I don't need people to tell me anymore. I know it, but every now and then I do it anyway. But my real guilty pleasure is chocolate. I even had my doctor recently ask me, he said, "You're not a chocoholic, are you?" And I said, "Oh, no, no, no. But I'm totally a chocoholic." And so there are things in terms, I've always been mindful of my health or tried to be. There's some things that as I do them, I go, okay, I know I shouldn't do it, but you got to have something, right? And that's it for me.
So question three, if you could not write anymore, Is there another art form that you think you would have to channel your creative juices into?
Oh, wow. That's a good question. I would be in trouble if I couldn't write anymore. And I am in my 70s, and so I know that day may come eventually. But I always say, when my mind goes, my books might get better. Possible. They would be more imaginative. Um, I like to paint pictures, not like the wall, but
Mhm.
paint pictures. And the problem with that is I'm not very good at it. I just like doing it every now and then.
Sometimes that's the point in and of itself, is just enjoying doing art. It doesn't have to be good art. You just have to enjoy doing it.
Yeah, I have a few. I have a picture I'm looking at right now in my office that I painted, and it's okay. It's as one art instructor told me one time. She looked at my painting and she said, "Well, it's colorful."
Question 4. Are you a morning person or a night owl?
I'm a morning person. I get up early and walk my dogs and grab a little something to eat, have a cup of coffee while I'm on a chat every morning with other 5 days a week with other authors. We talk to each other early in the morning, get each other going. A group that I've talked with for a long time, and some of them are from Europe, by the way. And uh, and then I sit down and start writing. I write for 50 minutes and I make myself get up. Oh, I do some exercising first. I write for 50 minutes, make myself get up and move around for 10 minutes, then I write for another 50. I take a lunch break. I mean, I'm just such a worker bee. That's the way my life was for so long that it just works for me. And I enjoy it.
That's an incredible schedule.
Yeah, I like it. I enjoy it.
I am so not a morning person. Now, for question 5, I have been asking every author the same thing because I'm compiling a list that's going to go into our year end book buying guide, which you and your work will also be in, that will have a list of recommendations from the authors that we have spoken to this year of books that they recommend from other authors. So when somebody asks you, what book do you recommend that I read? Who is the first author you go to?
Oh my goodness. So this might surprise you, but one of my favorite authors of all time is Alexandre Dumas. He wrote The Three Musketeers, The Count of Monte Cristo, The Mask. I can just read his work over and over and over. And I think it's one of the reasons I like to always put some adventure into my stories. I also love recommending Tricia O'Malley, a current author that many of your listeners might be familiar with. And her books are a little bit different from mine. She writes romance fantasy, but I just love her settings and her characters. She writes Scottish, a lot of them set in Scotland and Ireland. Just really wonderful stories that immerse you in the place, and you feel like you go away feeling like you know those people, you've been with them. And so Tricia O'Malley, I like a lot. I also read a lot of Fiona Davis. Her dual timeline stories are fascinating to me. So those are a few that I would recommend.
Those are great recommendations. Now, let's remind everybody again who you are and where they can find your books.
I am Linda Hughes. I write romantic women's fiction across the board. That means that you'll sometimes also find in my books some mystery, some history. You will find some humor. Sometimes there's a ghost as well. So I like putting all of that together in my stories about women's journeys. And you can find me in many places, but all of my books are on Amazon, on ebook and paperback.
And you also have lindahughes.com where they can find links to all of that information. And we're going to have links to all of your information and buy links for your books in the description of today's podcast and on our website at burkhartbooks.com/podcast. So it will be very easy for everyone to find you and your work.
Dianne, thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure. You are a delight.
This has been so much fun. I always love it whenever I have an interview that I'm laughing this much because it's just a joy to have that conversation.
Ah, good. Me too.
So there you have it, folks. My fantastic interview with the wonderful and adorable Linda Hughes. She was so much fun to talk to, and the people that she has met through her life and gotten to be friends with, it's just absolutely amazing, her circle of friends. And it just lets you know what a wonderful person she must be. You must go to her website and check out the incredible catalog of books that she has. There's so much variety there. All of them have great reviews. You really do need to check her out. If you like women's fiction, if you like something with a little mystery, a little adventure, maybe a few ghosts, you're going to find something that you'll like in her catalog. So go check it out. You will not regret the time that you take to get to know her body of work. Now, next week, we're going to have our second ever writing team where we have both of the members of the writing team in the interview together. I'm going to be speaking with Charles Brakefield and Rox Berkey, the authors of the critically acclaimed and multi-award-winning Enigma series. They also have the Enigma Heirs series and the Magnolia Bluff Crime Chronicles. If you love thrillers and mystery, you're going to love these books. So don't miss out. It was so much fun. I'm going to have to start doing more of these because it's just really a blast having more conversation from different points of view. It's so much fun, and you're going to love listening to it. So be sure to come back next Wednesday. Now, as far as all of the things for Burkhart Books and Book Banter with Dianne Burkhart, I don't really have any new news, so I'm going to wait until we get back from vacation, and I'm sure I'll have some fantastic things to tell you then, because I'm going to be working on a lot of this stuff on the airplanes, because, what else am I going to do? Watch the same TV shows for 18 hours? I don't think so. I'm going to be working on all the things that I'm planning to get done for you, things like the app and the masterclass and all of those kinds of things. And hopefully I'll be able to give you all some details later in the season. So keep listening. Come back every Wednesday. And you know what time it is, folks. It is time for you all to go forth and be really happy.